it is something that I've thought about, and I'm sure you all have thought about quite a lot. When do you act? It's back to what you were describing on, 2 years ago, it was metaverse, and it really didn't disrupt us as much. So when you act as a board, I think is super important. You act too soon, and it's a problem. You act too late, and it's a problem. How do you think about that?
When and how to act is just an incredibly complex question, and I think it does go back to this notion of the engagement on what strategic disruption is relevant to your company and relevant to your strategy. AI, okay, well, what are your use cases? I mean, there's an ability to take what's happening and just get granular if we understand our company's strategies, our company's stakeholders, our company's role. And that extra work, I think, does require extra time at the board. When a company or board isn't clear about where it wants to play, and hasn't had those really deep opportunities for discussion of where it's going to place its bets. And it's not just the what, it's the trade-offs. Mm-hmm. Almost every discussion today has a really complex trade-off. And I think that's where the board adds so much value, is to make sure you're making these decisions in an informed, as holistic manner as possible. And it does require, I think, a heightened level of engagement by the board, bringing all of our experiences to the table, sometimes bringing a little more outside, I don't like relying on outsiders too much, but some really good thinkers who can stimulate a different level of thought in the boardroom. And again, I will hit this, not relying on old tools. If you take ERM, I'm annoyed with it. It's a base case. It's a backward looking. What happened and what are our risks today? Who's accounting for them? That's not what's relevant. I mean, it's marginally helpful. What's relevant today on when you act and when you don't act is any one of those risks quickly becomes a reputational risk, no matter which business continuity, cybersecurity, complex SEC investigation, factory goes down. What's relevant for a board and a company is what is your learning agility and DNA to handle any risk, no matter what happens, and that helps determine how and when we think about acting.
and I think, Kim, you said something really important, and I think it's why tabletop exercises are so important. And we're familiar with tabletop exercises for information security and cyber risk, and your audit committees or risk committees are probably involved in that. But tabletop exercises can happen elsewhere. I know at Overstock in February of 2000, we had a tabletop exercise for remote work. We felt like there was this new flu, there was something new coming out of China. Let's see what it's like to work from home. Mm-hmm. And we saw people that were more at risk.
Yeah.
Mothers who relied on childcare. In the tabletop exercise, they could still take their kids to the daycare center. But we said, what if that can't happen? And so I think, when do you do things? That's hard. Too soon, too early. You want to be Goldilocks and get it just right. But figuring out how to get it right is often helped by wargaming and trying things.
Absolutely. I would underscore that. There's such simple things that I've had come out of tabletop exercises, either making sure the company's doing them on multi-dimensions or rolling up to the board. I mean, there's just simple things if you think about it. A lot of business continuity or tabletop exercises assume that the phone system is working. Well, what happens if the phone system goes down and you find most people don't even have written down phone numbers, because we all keep them electronically. We don't remember them anymore. You have exercises, for example, with a kidnapping or something, where if you don't practice it and you get into a situation, you're like, well, do we pay ransom? Do we not? Well, does the payment of ransom violate FCPA or OFAC rules? Well, what's our risk tolerance as a board? You have tensions between all these regulatory rules. And so if we haven't practiced, because again, it's not just a linear what, it's a trade-off of what. It's a trade-off of risks all the time. Your communications people are going to inform the board and the CEO, well, you got to get out there, you got to say something. Your legal organization's going to say, shut up, don't say a word, you're going to acquire a duty to update, you're going to expose us. Well, if you haven't thought through that risk tolerance as a CEO, a management team, and a board, you don't want to be doing it in the midst of a crisis. So I think there is this sense of a little more opportunity for boards to get a little more practice, for management teams to get a little more practice on the DNA and learning agility of working in crisis, the DNA and learning agility of just working in a complex situation where you have to make quick calls. Industries and companies that have very great records on safety or manufacturing and linear and processing, those aren't always the skills that transfer over when you're in the midst of a crisis. So understanding, like, how do you need to switch gears and who are the people you got to lift up, because it's a different skill set.
No, it totally is, and I want to discuss a little bit more about this wargaming and tabletop exercises, just because it is so critical. And oftentimes, the way in which those scenarios are constructed, everything is about that. And because you do not have enough diversity, because you do not have enough experiences, because you do not have enough depth in a certain space, those scenarios are constructed in a very shallow way, and then you don't actually see what happens. I know Rumsfeld talked about this, right? Known knowns, unknown unknowns. As we think about that, what are those that come to your mind in terms of unknown unknowns? The pandemic was a huge one, and we dealt with it in a beautiful way, Jonathan. You described it, having those type of exercises. Other things that we need to worry about that are on your radar?
Well, I think weather and war are two, I don't know if they're unknown unknowns, because it feels like they're almost a known that they will happen. I think the changing workforce is an unknown. Each generation comes a little differently, and how is return to office worked? How are we recruiting to a new group of people? I think these are big strategic changes that come, and we don't really see them until we feel the ill effects. And so, I think that's important too.
Yeah.
Gotcha. There's a lot of attention today on activist investors, especially in the industries that you've been in. That was a knowing smile.
I've got scars to prove it.
Yes.
So talk to us a little bit about the ramifications of activist investors, on how a board works, how to deal with it, how to use it in an effective and positive way.
You mind if I start on that one?
You go ahead and start on that one.
So,
I don't think we can stop you if we try.
Yeah, exactly.
Overstock's had different activists at different times. And sometimes we successfully, I don't know if the right verb is, warded them off, but we engaged. We had an activist defense plan that had a sole point of contact that would talk to them, listen to their concerns. I do think you have to engage and listen, but I think it needs to be focused. We had other activists that came later that were successful, in my opinion, of dividing and conquering our board, where the board had an activist defense plan, which was to communicate through one person, but when they were attacked in the public, decided, well, gee, if I just call this activist up, they'll stop saying bad things about me. And had multiple board members then talking to the activist, and all of a sudden there were different messages that were coming and different things. And so, look, I think activists are almost a known in today's society. They're going to happen. And I think boards need to be confident that if we deal with an activist the right way, we can learn from them and make some changes, and we can win. I mean, Nelson Peltz is probably as well-heeled and as well publicized activist as there is, and yet he lost at Disney. And that's because Bob Iger and the board followed their activist defense plan. So I think as board members, one, it's really important to have thick skin You know, don't read the comments. Is that what they say? And you know, don't get drug around the nose by Twitter when activists use that in a big way. And then speak with a unified voice. See what you can learn. See what you can improve. No CEO is doing it perfectly. No board is doing it perfectly. And so hearing advice and then taking some of it with the more pixels in the pictures that the board sees than the pixels in the picture that the activist, often not an investor, a trader, sees from the outside is an important thing to do.
Yeah, I've dealt with, like so many of us, activists in so many different aspects of corporate life. I think one thing I think about for boards is to make sure we don't just say, be your own activists, but we actually have board and management do some exercises around that. So we should be thinking like an activist and challenging ourselves rather than waiting for an outside activist to come in. My experience is most of the time they don't have new ideas. Like there's things the boards have talked about for many years. Sometimes there's good and bad reasons we haven't executed on it, but it's not often the case that they bring something new. They often bring unencumbered ability to act in the short term or act without a care for full stakeholders. And being aware of those differences are important. Sometimes they do have some great ideas, open to listen, happy to listen, but other times it's educating them about things they might not be aware of, that there are very good reasons a company may or may not have taken a position. And then I would say that activists aren't created equal. So this is where advisors and others who are very skilled can help determine strategies with them, because sometimes I think we paint activists with a broad brush, but the approach to them should be so carefully tailored depending on what type of activist they are. And then a small tool, and I'm sure most of you do this, but to make sure your companies, your IR departments do periodic investor relations deep dives by an outside third party. How is the company viewed? Not just from an IR company perspective, but a real expert who can go do those stakeholder interviews, those 360s. I've just found those scans can sometimes help a board understand, ooh, you know, maybe our strategy hasn't been as clear here, or why aren't we getting our fair share of this investor group? That might be a bellwether that we need to tweak our strategy. So having those tools in your toolkit ahead of time, I think helps with a much more, as you say, kind of full-throated response, and it helps directors buck up a little bit and not be so beholden to Twitter feeds.
You know, you mentioned be your own activist. One of the things I loved to do as a CEO was get our management team together and spend significant time thinking about what do we need to keep doing, preserve, what do we need to stop doing, destroy, and what new things do we need to start doing, create. And I found that there were always lots of great ideas on what to destroy. And there was always a lot of pushback from one faction or another on destroying any of that. But you know, any organization that continues to exist grows like a bramble bush. And it just, if you are not pruning things and processes that made sense at one time don't make sense today, or they may still make sense, but now there's new technologies or better ways to do it. I found that was a great way to be kind of the internal activist.
Absolutely.
Create, preserve, and destroy. We did those exercises all the time.
Can I give a mundane example on
Yeah,
this
please
one?
do.
This is so down here and pedantic, but if you just take that example to board material and board agendas, back to my holy cow, like we're still having, I've challenged people, like, oh, well that report was given because Director X in 1999 asked a question and thought it was relevant. Well, why are we doing that report today? Or this agenda item was asked because Mr. Chairman from 5 years ago thought that. So like even just simply pruning your board agenda process, pruning your board materials process, just because we have electronic board platforms doesn't mean a company gets to load 3,033 pages in the appendix that you will be on trial for a deposition when you didn't read. So like I fight that stuff. It's the company's job to help give precise, actionable, informed, high data quality to the board. And everyone gets lazy to, just add it as an appendix. Just throw it in there. The directors, I think as directors, we need to fight that. We need to push back. We need to have our general counsels and corporate secretaries do a pruning exercises. I know it's much more mundane than you were talking about, but do a pruning exercises on our agendas, on how we're using our time, on what material, and making sure we're getting the best material and highest use of our quality time.
Now, this is a fascinating discussion because the environment around the ask is constantly changing.
Yes.
We just said that everything is changing faster than it ever has been.
Right.
But then if you keep the traditional asks as everything that is what you're providing, you're clearly disconnected from the environment that you're operating in and where it was designed. So
100%.
it's a huge
Well,
problem.
and I would say things change so fast that sometimes your ask by the time it gets delivered
It's irrelevant.
is irrelevant. And I think you have to empower management
Yes.
to say, board, we did that. It wasn't really worth sending
right.
to you, and move on. If you're going to get a report on the metaverse at your summer meeting, say no thanks.
I had one more note I was taking before this one that I want to hit. We had this really nice thought process around having an action plan, having a war game, having a tabletop exercise, and then we intersected with the different types of activist investors. Do you see a need for multiple types of plans in place? Because most boards tend to have one activist investor plan, but clearly today's environment seems to be bifurcating into more than one. Is that something that is being thought about and being done?
Well, I think it's good to have one plan and then modify it to who you're dealing with.
Exactly.
You may have a strategy for playing poker, but when you get dealt a certain hand, you play that hand a little different. I just think you may have raised your first child really well, and your second one comes along, and they're just very different. You got to play your hand different every time. And so
You hit a nerve there with the audience.
well, I've got 5 sons, and each couldn't be more different. So, but you have a strategy, and then you modify. I think that's
right.
the way to do it.
I think that's right. I think that's it.
All right, that's fantastic. We sort of said it's faster than ever. It's not just because we are
Right.
living in it that we feel it's faster. Objectively, change is faster than it used to be. We said when you act depends, and it's a really hard question, but really it's about having the resilience to act no matter what.